This is Jack Stanley, and I wanted to talk about the beginnings of the Civil War and what brought it about and why it all came to this massive explosion in the late 1850s. And there's a lot of reasons, and one of the most important is the fact that we had been carrying around our back and our neck like an albatross the issue of slavery. And that had begun from the very beginning of this country. You have to understand, when we even tried formulating a country and even coming with the initial concept of a country, the Declaration of Independence, there was a big battle over who constituted what. The interesting thing was, during the American Revolution, about 20 to 25% of the soldiers during the Revolution were African American. We hardly mention that fact. Yet during the arguments for the Declaration of Independence, the South walked out because that was property, it was not people. And there was a big battle, and Sam Adams and John Adams of Massachusetts argued that slavery needed to be abolished because it would be a crime and a sin that would never, ever repair itself. And they were completely overruled by many of the loggerheads there. And Sam Adams, who we don't hear about too much except for beer today, gave one of the most eloquent statements, and it's almost, it seems, many people would think it was apocryphal, but it's not. He said during that whole debate, he said, if we do not deal with this issue now, 100 years hence we will have to. And nearly 100 years later, we have the American Civil War. John Adams was pushing as well, and they were pushing for other things too, women's rights. They said women should have equal rights to men, and that went nowhere either. And next time you knock John Adams, remember how far ahead he was of everybody else. Benjamin Franklin finally convinced them that let's form a country first, and then we can kind of solve our ills, solve our problems. And God, we had a lot of them. And it's one of the things about this republic is from its formation, it has slowly, sometimes far too slowly, repaired its ills. It has a lot more ills to repair, actually. But the interesting thing was slavery, women's rights. Men of property were the only people that could vote, and anyone else was out. And if you were of some kind of race that they didn't look upon as being American, good luck. That's the way it all started. The Constitution doesn't mention slavery once, by the way. Of course, it has some very nefarious things in there to deal with the issue because they didn't want to deal with the issue. Because they were trying to form a government, and if they pushed too hard, the South would leave. So slavery was put onto the back shelf for a while, and several generations of individuals who were slaves had to suffer through that. Of course, things got worse as time went on, as we get into the beginnings of the latter 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century. There's lots of problems. By the time we reach 1820, of course, we have the Compromise of 1820. We have compromises in 1830. We have all different types of band-aids that were put on to try to cure the problem without really dealing with the problem. And that massive bandage, the Compromise of 1850, we were about as close to civil war as you can get. And interestingly enough, the compromise was figured out. The three old timers from the Congress, of course, Henry Clay, John Calhoun, Daniel Webster had finally agreed and worked this compromise, and the president refused to sign it. And then they said, oh my God, it's going to happen. There's going to be a civil war. And as tension rose and rose and rose and everything was ready to explode, the most remarkable thing happened. The president died. And the vice president, who was Millard Fillmore, took over and said, I'll sign it. He didn't want to deal with a civil war. Amazing, if Zachary Taylor had lived, the Civil War probably would have started in the 1850s. And it might have had very different results or maybe even better results. We don't know. You know, I think that sometimes we may knock Zachary Taylor, but maybe he might have proved himself to be pretty incredible. We have no idea. But Millard Fillmore signed the document, and that solved the situation. But by the mid-1850s, nothing was going to save the situation. It was on a downward fall. And the two sides were like vinegar and baking soda. You put them together, it explodes. I mean, you just couldn't do it. You had Kansas. You had two different constitutions in Kansas. One for a free state, one for a slave state. You had what had started pretty much everything was the killing of the gag rule. You know, you couldn't talk about slavery in Congress because of the gag rule. Who defeated it? John Quincy Adams in 1844. Therefore, you could talk about it. Let's just get the match and light the fuse. And that's pretty much what happened. Now, nobody else afterwards could figure a way to get a pair of scissors to cut the fuse before it hit the dynamite. And this went on for years. And then you had these situations, and probably some of the most awful, which was like the Dred Scott decision, which was constitutionally correct, morally reprehensible, and truly lacking any imaginative power. And of course, that became the law. And that pushed everything separated, pushed everything further apart. And then, of course, you had John Brown's raids. And John Brown was no great, beautiful guy, all right? He was a thug. I mean, let's just face it. And he went to Harper's Ferry, and of course he was going to do a slave revolt. And the interesting thing is, on the train down, getting there, one of the first people he shot and killed was an African American. That's not what he was there to do, but he did it. And of course they did their revolt. He was captured and he was hanged for his offenses. Under the control of Robert E. Lee. He was the fellow that was in charge of the hanging. Now, this absolutely terrified the South. And in a way, in the North, they looked at him as a hero, but he wasn't. He was a hero to no one. He was a bit of a thug. I mean, his career back in Kansas was nothing but blood. He killed an awful lot of people. And then, of course, nothing seemed to be able to help things. And James Buchanan was woefully inadequate to deal with the situation. He was a diplomat. That's what he was, and he was too old. He just didn't have the imaginative powers. And I've been reading through this stuff. I mean, this is the Committee of Five in the House of Representatives dealing with all the various takeovers of forts and everything. This is all 1860. This is everything happening. It's fascinating to read. This is the book that James Buchanan wrote, and I think I've shown this to you before. I don't remember. But this is called the Buchanan Administration, written by James Buchanan, but he doesn't put his name anywhere. And he talks about himself in the third person, which is quite fascinating. This is the first book written about the John Brown situation. This was written, let me see, I think it was 1860. I mean, he was executed in December, what was it, December 1859, I believe, right around there. And this fellow went down and did all the research and everything else, and northern individual, and makes him look a little bit like a remarkable hero. But all of this stuff was happening, and there was just no way to stop it. And it was basically an irrepressible force. And the politicians of the time had no idea what to do. Buchanan totally messed up the situation. He offended everybody. Not deliberately, but he just didn't have the ability. And Lincoln, let's be honest, if Lincoln had not been assassinated, our opinion of Lincoln, our understandings of Lincoln, the ability to politicize Lincoln would have been very, very different. I mean, many of the things that he did were pure politics. I mean, the Proclamation of Emancipation really did nothing. It freed the slaves in an area it had no control. So, I mean, it sounds good, but it wasn't. But it did everything. It demoralized the South. It gave the North a reason to fight. And it told Europe, stay the hell out of here, because we were real close to a civil war. I mean, it's amazing all the stuff that was happening. All leading up to civil war. Slavery was the reason. Now you got to understand, as I said before, slavery was the battle all the way from the beginning of the formation of this country. It was our original sin. And it took a long time to cure. And even when it was cured, it wasn't. Because you had the radical Republicans that did the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, Thaddeus Stevens, all those folks. And they were fantastic. But the sad part is, before long, everything was forgotten. New issues happened. Congress changed. And the African Americans got pushed. And Martin Luther King said it best in his speech, I've Got a Dream. He talks about, in the beginning of the speech, which I think is far more important than the I've got a dream part, he said, I've come here with a check that was issued 100 years ago. And it was just returned saying insufficient funds. And it was basically talking about emancipation. And emancipation hadn't quite happened yet. So the Civil War is a fascinating period of time. It was operated by some amazing personalities who did not agree on much of anything. You had Lincoln, you had Buchanan, you had Jefferson Davis, you had Stephen Douglas for a short while until he died. But all of these people pulling, because you had popular sovereignty, you had states' rights, you had slavery, you wanted to expand slavery. I mean, all of these things, and every part was tugging at this country and ripping it to shreds. And unfortunately, it led to a civil war, a bloody civil war, that had Lincoln seen what 1865 looked like, he never, ever would have pushed for. I don't think Jefferson Davis would have pushed for. Amazing period of time, isn't it, when you think about it? All of those individuals, all of those various things that were done. And yet we still had the Civil War. Everyone was screaming about it. Everybody was trying to prevent it. And it was like trying to prevent a tidal wave. It happened. And we're still, in many respects, suffering from the effects of the United States and its Civil War, 1861, 1865. It will forever influence this country and forever damage in many respects. Because what was done at that time, how things were done, how things were repaired, will have a profound effect on the generations that followed and their attitudes and understandings. Thank you very much.